Hi, and thanks for joining me. I'm Dr. ASMR Reiki, and in this video, I want to help you relax and fall asleep by sharing an intriguing story about Aristotle, the ancient Greek philosopher, scientist, and teacher who's widely considered one of the greatest minds in history. But did Aristotle even exist? Did he write all the books attributed to him? I'll address these questions over the next several minutes in a calm and soothing way. I'm a professor in my day job, and so I figured if my lecture material could make students fall asleep in class, it might help some of you as well. But before the story begins, let's take a few moments to center ourselves. And I need this as much as you do, I'm sure. So let's focus on our breathing. Take a few breaths. In through your nose, out through your mouth. In through your nose, out through your mouth. In through your nose, out through your mouth. In through your nose, and out through your mouth. Okay, with that, I'll start this story. So Aristotle was born in 384 BCE in Stagira, a city in northern Greece. He studied under Plato and later tutored Alexander the Great. He taught and conducted research in Athens for many years, and he fled Chalcis after Alexander's death, where he would die in 322 BCE. Okay, so Aristotle was born in 384 BCE in Stagira, a city in northern Greece. He studied under Plato, the famous philosopher, and he later tutored Alexander the Great, the most famous military mind in all of history. Aristotle taught and conducted research in Athens for many years, eventually fleeing for Chalcis after Alexander's death, where he died in 322 BCE. Aristotle believed in finding a balance between extremes. This belief reflected in his ideas about ethics and politics. He also proposed what we call the great chain of being, which later justified the hierarchy among men as part of the natural order of the universe. Nevertheless, Aristotle held that virtues like courage, temperance, and wisdom represented the balance between cowardice, recklessness, and ignorance, a principle now known as virtue ethics. He spent his life believing that the best form of government is a constitutional one in which power is shared among different groups. Now, Aristotle made substantial contributions to the fields of logic and scientific observation, including developing the philosophical syllogism, a method of logical reasoning still in use today. You might be familiar with syllogisms even if you don't know the name. For instance, if 1 plus 1 equals 2, then 1 plus 2 equals 3. Now, in addition to philosophy and ethics, Aristotle wrote groundbreaking works on biology, such as history of animals, as well as parts of animals. His ideas and his works deeply influenced Western philosophy, science, and culture. Philosophers and scientists studied and commented on his works throughout the centuries, and they continue to study them today. All of this has made him one of the most famous philosophers of all time. Aristotle's relationship with Alexander the Great, the father of the Western world, contributed to Aristotle's popularity. When Alexander was a teenager, Aristotle became his personal tutor, and the two developed a close relationship. Alexander is said to have been so deeply influenced by Aristotle's teachings. These included subjects of philosophy, of politics, of rhetoric, as well as an early version of what you might call a scientific method. And the two read Homer's Iliad, The Tale of Achilles, amongst many other works. Alexander learned from Aristotle to trust only what he could see and to find ways to test what he thought he could trust. Unfortunately, his tutelage ended when Alexander was only 16 years old, when his father Philip was assassinated. At that time, Alexander took the throne and began the military campaigns that made him so famous. Alexander's empire stretched from Greece all the way to India, making him considered one of the greatest military leaders of all time. Now, their formal relationship ended, but they continued to correspond throughout Alexander's campaigns. And the general would send him books and gifts. And Alexander continued to respect and admire Aristotle throughout his life. Their relationship was largely positive. And Alexander is said to have even deeply influenced Aristotle, of course, vice versa. This helped the one of them to become a more thoughtful and effective leader, and the other of them to become a more effective teacher. It is said that Alexander was so impressed by Aristotle's teachings that he asked him to become his chief advisor and to create a new city where philosophers and scholars could live and study together. It would have a magnificent library at the mouth of the Nile River. Unfortunately, Aristotle refused the offer, but the city was later built by Alexander, taking his own name. Now, it's hard to downplay how useful Aristotle's relationship to Alexander was for Aristotle's posterity. Aristotle's writings were studied and commented upon by many philosophers and scientists, and his works have had a profound influence because of it. Unfortunately, many of Aristotle's works were not preserved through the centuries, some texts being lost over time, and the works that we have today, well, there don't remain too many. Here is a list of some of the main works that are credited to Aristotle. One is called the Organon. It's a collection of works on logic. It includes the categories on interpretation, prior analytics, posterior analytics, topics, and I think sophistical refutations. Another is the classic metaphysics, one of the most famous philosophy texts in all of the world, where he discusses the nature of being and the ultimate causes of everything. Another of his most famous works is the Nicomachean Ethics, where he discusses the nature of happiness and the virtues necessary to achieve it. Another important of his works is simply Politics, where he discusses the best form of government and the nature of justice. He also has a Poetics, a work on literary theory. Sounds boring. But there he discusses the nature of tragedy and poetry. Rhetoric. He yet still finds another book to write in the form of rhetoric, where he discusses the art of persuasion and the different types of rhetoric. ASMR is a style of persuasion. A couple other of his books include Physics. As you guessed it, it's about physics. And another, usually called On the Soul, which is kind of like a psychology book, where he discusses the nature of the soul and how our bodies and our souls are related. And then, as I mentioned at the beginning, he wrote on animals. He was a biologist in a way. He wrote books that explained how certain animals work, including a book specifically about the body parts of animals. Some of these works, even the famous ones, we don't have the entire works. Some of them only survive in fragments. But here's what's rarely discussed in school. Many of the texts that have been attributed to Aristotle were actually written by someone else. Scholars, we generally agree that the works I just mentioned are considered authentic and written by Aristotle. But how do we know? The truth is we don't. Many have speculated that his metaphysics is basically him stealing from ancient Egyptian philosophers. Other texts may have come from other places. Some of the books that bear his name were likely written by his students. The ancient world did not have the same concepts of authorship and copyright that we have today. And it was common for texts to be passed around and copied by scholars. Remember, we didn't have copy machines or PDFs. Because of that, it's possible that some texts that we've attributed to Aristotle were actually written by someone else. For instance, the Aristotelian corpus is a collection of texts attributed to Aristotle, but it's possible that some of these texts were not written by him at all. Scholars have considered many of those texts spurious, deceitful, not true. One of them is called the Constitution of Athens, which is a detailed account of the political system there in Athens. Most scholars today generally agree that the text was not written by Aristotle, but one of his students or one of his followers. It makes you wonder. Additionally, it's also worth noting that Aristotle's original writings didn't survive the centuries intact. What we have today are mostly copies that have been made of his works. And it's a pretty good guess that many of those copies were modified or altered over time. Could it be that one of the most famous philosophical treatises of all time amounts to an act of plagiarism? Mentioned earlier, the Metaphysics is a collection of texts that's been handed down through the centuries. It includes a passage known as the Sea Battle. The Sea Battle. The Sea Battle. Here he describes a hypothetical battle that's used to illustrate a point about the nature of truth. And scholars have noted that this passage is not at all consistent with Aristotle's usual style and vocabulary, and it's believed to be a later addition to the text. So who wrote it? And why don't we know? And why weren't we taught that Aristotle is complicated? Many more of these texts were edited or commented on by Aristotle and his text by others. It was common practice in the ancient world where philosophers would read and comment on the works of their predecessors. And these commentaries would often be included with the original texts. For instance, the Poetics is a work that Aristotle wrote on literary theory, like I said before. But it turns out many scholars believe that he commented on or edited works of poetry that were already in circulation, rather than writing original poetry himself. Many have simply suggested that it was him. But how could one man be all of these things? It's also worth noting that there are texts that are falsely attributed to Aristotle in order to give them more authority. This was also a common practice in the ancient world, where texts written by lesser-known authors would be attributed to more famous figures in order to give them more credibility. One example of this is a work attributed to Aristotle called the Rhetoric of Alexander. Today, this text is widely considered an outright forgery. It's framed as a letter from Aristotle to Alexander the Great. But now scholars believe it was written long after Aristotle's death, and therefore couldn't possibly be an authentic work of Aristotle's. Take a breath with me. It's important to maintain a high degree of uncertainty when it comes to the authorship of ancient texts, both attributed to Aristotle and others. We should approach these texts with a critical and analytical mindset. But you'll be hard-pressed to hear this kind of honesty from a classics professor. That's not what I am. But just keep in mind that these are just examples, and there is ongoing scholarly debate about the authorship and authenticity of many of the texts attributed to Aristotle and other ancient philosophers. About as soon as folks realized we had been wrong about who we had named the authors of so many of these books, it became popular to simply stop asking the question of who wrote them. It makes you wonder why. Why that shift? Was it a denial of our arrogance, the shame of having been wrong? Or did we really know where they came from, but we didn't want to admit that? Now, worth mentioning as well, just because some guy named Aristotle might not have written these books doesn't make the ideas in them any less valuable. In a way, the great Aristotelian plagiarism debacle shows how important the texts were then and how important they've been for centuries and centuries. What it does mean for us is that our teachers, our professors, they've lied to us just a little bit about this guy named Aristotle. So to conclude, I want to pose the question, do we have any real evidence for Aristotle at all? Well, fortunately, it turns out the answer is yes. He was a real person. He was very much a well-known philosopher and teacher and scientist. His life and works were recorded by many other ancient authors, and assuming they were real, some of these include Plutarch, Diogenes Laertius, and Strabo. Aristotle's writings were studied and commented upon by many philosophers and scientists throughout the centuries, and his works have had such a powerful influence on Western philosophy, science and culture, art, education. His works, the works attributed to him, have been widely read and studied, and his ideas and concepts have been part of the Western philosophical tradition for centuries. It's hard to overstate how influential he's been. In addition to this historical impact, some are compelled by archaeological finds that support the existence of Aristotle. For example, in the ancient city of Stagira, where Aristotle was born, I told you, there are ruins of a gymnasium that's believed to have been built by his father. And there are also inscriptions and statues that have been found in other parts of Greece and Asia Minor that attest to his existence. And I think that is fairly compelling evidence. There was a man named Aristotle, but in a sense, he was also a fraud. While surely he did write about ideas, and some of his books might have even been written himself, his relationship to Alexander was powerful enough to ensure he had the authority to basically collect all the ancient texts that Alexander came across. Could it be that he just smacked his name on the cover of them? He had taught Alexander. Surely Alexander knew to look for sacred texts, ancient wisdom, wherever he went. And surely he shared some of that with Aristotle. It makes you wonder. So, thank you for being here. Thank you for listening to this story. I'll end with a note on the library at Alexandria. Aristotle ended up not having any specific impact on the creation of Alexandria, but it's believed that Alexander surely continued to celebrate the life and the learning made possible by Aristotle. Surely many of Aristotle's books, many that he might have written and many more that he didn't write but that bore his name, ended up in the library at Alexandria. Unfortunately, Julius Caesar, during a civil war, in I think 48 BCE, caused that library to burn. And in that fire, we lost countless untold texts. Many think in that fire we lost the wisdom of the ancient world. That library contained the evidence of Atlantis, where it was. The library contained ancient maps. The library could have contained the information about the Anunnaki and the Sumerian origins. But we'll never know. And surely that library would have contained the evidence we would need now to figure out what books Aristotle really wrote. But because it burned, we'll never know. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this story. I hope it's been restful for some of you. Maybe entertaining, maybe boring. But either way, I hope it's helped you to fall asleep. If you like this, please consider subscribing and liking the video, of course. This channel is an experiment, like I mentioned. I have another channel that I've just started, my professional channel. It's Christopher Driscoll, Ph.D. I think I'm going to keep this current channel, Dr. ASMR Reiki, alive for a while, but I'm going to also be posting this material at the other channel. And the reason, for any of you still awake, the reason is simple. ASMR and Reiki is kind of like the sugar pill that goes with the medicine in my work. It's all medicine. It's all medicine. I appreciate your support, your encouragement, and I would really welcome any feedback. What you'd like to see, but also how I could get better at doing this. So if you like this, consider subscribing and stay tuned. I'll continue to post somewhat regularly, and I'll look forward to seeing what comes of this experiment. Thanks for being here, and sweet dreams.